A shock victory pulls the Netherlands to the right. A familiar face in Dutch politics, Eurosceptic anti-Islam Geert Wilders is the longest-serving lawmaker, but never the leader. Could that be about to change? And what would it mean for the Netherlands, the EU, and the world? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is Geert Wilders. Among the first to call and congratulate Geert Wilders on his PVV party's victory were Europe's far-right royalty, Hungary's Viktor Orban and France's Marine Le Pen. Orban celebrated, saying the Netherlands' vote ushered in the winds of change, which, according to their similar ideologies, means stopping immigration, especially from Muslim countries, criticizing climate change science, and denouncing the EU. It was an unexpected victory, and it remains to be seen if Wilders will form a coalition with him as prime minister. But still, the Trump of the Netherlands has come a long way. Here's a look now at his rise to the top.
Dutch Trump has shocked the Netherlands. Anti-Islam populist Geert Wilders' Freedom Party came out on top in last week's parliamentary election, well ahead of its closest rival, Frans Timmermans' leftist alliance. The centre-right People's Party for Freedom and Democracy, led by Dylan Jesselkoes, who was widely tipped to be the next PM, came in a disappointing third.
This is the happiest day of my life so far in politics. We became the #1 party by far. I mean, it's what a lot of people, if you would have asked them a year ago, would call you mad, and it happened today.
Wilders has been a regular in Dutch politics and Europe's far-right circles for over 2 decades. He founded the Freedom Party in 2006, with hardline opposition to Islam at the center of his policy. His fierce rhetoric found support among many Dutch people. He proposed a ban on religion, including mosques, the Quran, and headscarves.
Do I have a problem with Islam? Yes, I do have a problem with Islam.
Wilders blamed immigration for the country's housing and crime problems. He promised to stop accepting asylum seekers and push back migrants at the Dutch border. In 2016, he was convicted of inciting discrimination after calling for fewer Moroccans in the Netherlands during a campaign rally. But the conviction didn't stop his inflammatory comments.
Once again, not all are scum, but there is a lot of Moroccan scum in Holland who makes the streets unsafe.
Wilders also wants to withdraw from the Paris Agreement on climate change, promising more oil and gas extraction from the North Sea. And he's a staunch critic of the European Union. In 2005, he helped to kill a proposal for an EU constitution. He has accused the bloc of ineffectiveness in curbing migration and pledged to abolish EU agricultural regulations and hold an exit referendum.
We would hold a referendum in the Netherlands for what we call an exit, the Dutch leaving, in order to be able to toughen up our immigration policies. It cannot be done, and it will not be done by Brussels and the European Union. You have to become a sovereign nation again in order to do that.
Despite being in the Dutch parliament for years, Wilders has been largely excluded from government. The main parties have long seen him as an unreliable partner and too radical. And ahead of the vote, opinion polls did not suggest Wilders had much of a chance. But the Freedom Party's unexpected victory has put him in a pole position to become the country's next prime minister. But it will not be easy. Despite winning the most seats, Wilders still needs the support of 2 or more parties to form a government.
But this can long for 1 hour, for 1 year, 1.5 years. That we have a tradition of very long coalition building processes. So it's far too early to say if he will become the next prime minister.
Following the victory, Wilders hinted at a willingness to compromise on some of his more extreme policies in order to get the backing of other parties.
I understand very well that parties do not want to be in a government that takes unconstitutional measures. So we are not going to do that. We are not going to talk about mosques and Qurans and Islamic schools. We are going to talk about that agenda of hope that the Dutch have now supported en masse.
Despite Wilders' softer tone, Muslim organizations and rights groups are still concerned about the country's future. And the historically moderate Netherlands' turn to the far right might deepen the EU's troubles as well.
So with implications for the EU, the climate, and immigration, let's talk about what Geert Wilders' victory means to the Netherlands and the rest of us. Well, joining me now from Rotterdam is Joram Van Klaveren, a former far-right Dutch MP and now a policy advisor for SPIOR. From Amsterdam, we have Edward Koning, an associate professor of political science at the University of Guelph. And in Paris is Yasser Louati, a political analyst and the host of the podcast Le Breakdown with Yasser Louati. Thanks all so much for being with me. Joram, I'll start with you. How did pollsters get this so wrong? What was so lacking in the lives of Dutch people to lead them to vote for this extreme?
First of all, thank you for the invitation. What we've seen a couple of years already now is that Geert Wilders has like a base of, let's say, 10 to 12 seats in parliament. That's the hardcore base. And on top of this, so the additional votes he got from several crises, as they call it here. One is the housing crisis. There are a lot of people looking for a house. They cannot get it because there are no houses. Another thing is that taxes are very high. So living expenses for a lot of people are risen such level that it's almost undoable to live the life they want to. And another thing is that a lot of people nowadays see the government as a threat instead of a friend. And the combination of all these factors makes this additional win of Geert Wilders reality.
But it sounds like you think it was more domestic issues rather than ideological issues. Is that fair?
It is, because, of course, I have been an MP for the Freedom Party a long time. What we've seen is that the hardcore base, the people, let's say, up to 12 seats, those people voted ideologically for Geert Wilders. Doesn't matter what he says, how he says it, they will vote for him anyway because of the agenda, anti-Islam, anti-immigration, etc. But these people now, so the additional votes he gained, those are more domestic than the hardcore seats of 12. That's correct.
Okay, Edward, are you on the same page? And I'll ask you as well then, if it is that, why did the pollsters get this so wrong?
Yeah, so I think I don't necessarily disagree with what Joram was saying, but I might add a thing or two. So the pollsters got it wrong, but it was a very unusual election. So actually, what we've seen throughout the course of the election campaign, there was 3 different parties that are in many, different parties with different ideological orientations, but all of them very much opposed to the existing order. And at various times during the campaign, they were polling to become the largest party in parliament. And what you see is that the surge of the PVV in the polls only really kicked in about a week before election day. So, and on top of that, there was an unusually large number of voters this year who made up their mind in the actual ballot box. So I think a large part of the story is that the existing government was widely unpopular, and that the election was to some extent driven by, for many voters, especially that portion of the PVV vote that Joram was talking about that are not the hardcore PVV supporters, by a logic of anything except for anything but the center right. As long as the center right doesn't win, then we're good. And so for one time, that seemed to be like an animal interest, an agricultural interest party. At another point, it seemed to be this party of a whistleblower who ran on a campaign of political integrity. And towards the end, it seemed like the PVV was the most realistic party to topple the center right. And I think lots of people just jumped on that bandwagon.
Okay. Yasser, you are, of course, in France, French citizen. So do you worry, seeing the result of this election next door, about the Europe-wide rise of these populist right-wing politicians like Wilders? You know, whether it's Giorgia Meloni in Italy, if it's Viktor Orban in Hungary, Finland, Greece, Slovakia. What does it say to you?
Well, we have been ringing the alarm bell for years now, and sometimes we get tired of doing it, and then you wake up next morning, you have to do it again. First, whether these parties win elections or not, we have to keep in mind that their ideas are already in power. We've seen many mainstream conservative parties, even left-wing mainstream parties adopting the ideas coming from the far right. And I can speak, for example, for France, which I know the most. But the outcome of this election is that first, we see that the adoption of racism and state authoritarianism is no longer repulsive for many voters, because again, as I said earlier, these policies were pursued by more mainstream parties. And for voters, it is no longer an act of shame to vote for Marine Le Pen or Orban or Wilders, to name a few. And this also happens as the EU project is failing the European people. You have unelected officials that draft and pass policies over which people have no say. And that is why it is not a coincidence to see these parties openly either calling for leaving the EU. We saw an iteration with Brexit. We have these same ideas running around in France, even though Marine Le Pen has backed off to remain respectable, but also the idea that we see many far-right politicians being adopted by the political and the media elite, and this happens all across Europe. The concentration of media ownership, be it the UK, France, or elsewhere, shows that we see the convergence of big money and the media in order to promote these far-right ideas, which in turn become political victories. And just a last point before I finish, we cannot underestimate the responsibility of voters when to them it is an acceptable price to pay to see parties specifically targeting their fellow countrymen because they are black, brown, or Muslim. So there is also responsibility of voters in pushing these parties to where they are today.
Okay, but just quickly, Yasser, so when you hear our other analysts say that actually the vote in the Netherlands was much more about domestic issues, do you think they're downplaying a bigger problem here?
Well, why haven't these voters chosen left-wing parties? Why haven't they chosen people pushing for the welfare state? If they are complaining about taxes, if they are complaining about the cost of living and housing, which I do agree, these problems are structural because of the way our economies have been geared for the past 2 decades. But why go for these parties who themselves are more aligned with the stock market and big money than actually with promoting the welfare state and bringing about a better chance of living a decent life with acceptable financial means? The question is
Joram, can you answer? Yes. Oh, okay, go ahead, Edward. Or no, Joram first, and then Edward, I'll come to you. Same thing.
Okay, sure.
I think it's a good thing mentioned. But the fact is that the Freedom Party isn't so much a right-wing party. When you look at the economy, they are very left-wing. So that makes them very attractive for both people from the left and the right. It is like a political strategy because in the past, like in 2009, 2010, we've discussed this topic inside the party as well, because they used to be, when the Freedom Party just started in 2006, it was like the Republican Party in the United States, very right-wing on the economy, on immigration, on criminal rates, etc. But what they did, they changed it. They said, well, we have to be acceptable and we have to be attractive for left-wing voters who don't have so much money. So we have to be soft on the topics we can be soft. So think about the welfare state, stuff like that. And on the other side, we have to be tough when it comes to criminals. We have to be tough on immigration. We have to be tough on Islam. So they made it like a hybrid organization. That's why a lot of people didn't vote for the left, because when you look at some topics, he's even more left-wing than left-wing organizations.
Yeah. Edward, it seems like you agree. I see you nodding your head.
Yeah, this is an important point, and it is indeed in many countries where you see parties like the PVV thrive. They manage to have achieved that result by basically fragmenting the traditional base for the left for precisely the reasons Joram mentioned, and it was very interesting to hear his insider story on that. I think the one other thing I would say as well is that I think. Yasser was exactly right when he started by pointing at the main explanation for all this has to be looked at the level of the political elite, more so I would say than at the voter. So I think what we have seen is that Wilders has over time become normalized in Dutch politics, right? And so he has been around for a very long time. On top of that, the center-right party got a new leader in anticipation of this election, and she indicated that she was not necessarily opposed to governing with Wilders, and so all of this has created this this image of Wilders as a pretty mainstream politician, right? Like as exactly as Yasser was saying, not someone that you necessarily have to be worried about, not an extremist, just sort of like another option on the ballot box. And I think that's definitely part of the story.
You know, Yasser, as you mentioned of Marine Le Pen, we're seeing Geert Wilders tone down his rhetoric, saying he won't talk about mosques, he won't talk about Qurans or Islamic schools going forward. Then what do you make of that? Is that sincere, or is that temporary in order to see if he can win over coalition partners first, and then he'll sneak back to his old ways? Go ahead.
I mean, definitely. I mean, like, you know, who's going to, I mean, like, you cannot judge a person on over one speech after, as you know, I heard right before, decades of promoting the same ideas. So yes, you know, we have seen that, for example, with Marine Le Pen's party, when they win over city halls across France, they will come and say, we have been elected by the people, we will work for everybody. But their policies, their first obsession is not to bring about meaningful change for their constituents, but to shut down mosques, criminalize Muslim leaders, etc. We heard that from Emmanuel Macron after, you know, the second round of the election. He said he was going to be the anti-Marine Le Pen. Yet once he got re-elected, he went after Muslims and passed the more Islamophobic laws of the past 2 decades. So there are reasons to worry, because first, we see people being against some form of racism. They will feel ashamed about anti-Semitism, but they will feel okay with Islamophobia. And this sends the message that France has not properly dealt with its history of racism, and it has not properly, you know, managed to wipe it out of its political landscape. But what this means in return for the majority of Europeans is that the anti-freedom policy that will be passed by these governments, of course, they will be passed in the name of fighting Muslim fundamentalism, Islamism, etc. Fill the blank with ism. But once these laws are passed, as we have seen it in France in the past 5 or 6 years, these laws will be passed against political dissenters. We have seen anti-Muslim laws being applied against unions, against, you know, community leaders from the left, etc. And today we really ask ourselves, how far will the center of gravity of European politics further shift towards the far right?
Okay. Joram, let me come back to you, because, yeah, as there are some kind of, I don't know if they could be called outliers, because maybe it's just in very specific conditions that this is happening, where, for example, in Spain, everyone was talking about the rise of the right, and then we saw an election that actually punished the right wing instead. And now we're hearing people talk about what's happening to Geert Wilders. He's just lost his appointed scout to form a coalition because of corruption charges, and he's admitted he's not off to the best start. So let's start there. Do you think he will actually be able to form a coalition?
Yeah, I think he will. But
will he be prime minister?
Could be, yeah. I don't think that's the most realistic option, but I think it could be. But it depends a little bit on what they will discuss when they have their talks, because that's the most important one. What they did now, his scout, so to say, the one who investigates whether it is possible or not to have a coalition in the first place. The one he has now is a former minister of the Labour Party. So he asked, and that I think it's a very smart move of his, from his perspective, of course, to bring someone who is acceptable for a lot of parties now. So that makes it easier for him to talk. And then again, what Yasser already said, the thing is he didn't really change his views, of course. It's a political strategy because what we've seen, for example, the Flemish interest, Vlaams Belang, that's the Belgium version of the Freedom Party, so to say. In the past, they were very anti-Semitic, very anti-Semitic. And in the end, because all these parties are in one bigger party, a European party, Geert Wilders started his tour in 2012 to form a coalition, a European coalition. And he succeeded because there are a lot of organizations now working together. So that's the international, on an international level. And what they discussed, one of the things they discussed back then was that when they talk about anti-Semitism, for example, the FPO in Austria, the Freedom Party in Austria, and the Flemish interest in Belgium, they were very anti-Semitic. But they changed. They no longer are anti-Semitic, they're only anti-Islam. So why did they do that? Because most of the European peoples, they have had this negative feeling about anti-Semitism, but they not necessarily have that when it comes to anti-Islam. So it's a political strategy. It's the same like that where he said now, well, all my topics when it comes to Islam, they're in the fridge. Yeah, in the fridge is something else than in the basement or thrown overboard, so to say. So it's something he still believes in, but it will be step by step.
It's interesting, though. I mean, that they may have changed, but the core racism and prejudice, it's still there. It's still there.
Absolutely.
Yasser, if you have a quick comment, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to bounce on what has been just said right now, is that the whitewashing of anti-Semitism in Europe, especially in the case of France, has been laid bare a couple of weeks ago when the government called for a demonstration against anti-Semitism in which the far-right party of Marine Le Pen, which was set up by people who collaborated with the Nazis, were also accepted. So we see the completion of Marine Le Pen's normalization enterprise, and I do agree. I think Dr. Farid Hafez from the University of Salzburg wrote a paper some years ago about the turn by European far-right parties from anti-Semitism to Islamophobia in order to gain more respectability, because so far European institutions have no problem with Islamophobia, despite what they preach, especially when they pass laws against Muslim minorities in Europe.
Okay. Edward, where does all this take the European project itself, the European Union? Is Nexit possible? There's one angle there. And the Netherlands exit. And also, if we're down to our few minutes, so I also wanted to include where this turn to the right could actually take climate change. I mean, the Netherlands was seen as a leader. That's of zero interest to Wilders to keep up with the green funding and move toward, a carbon neutral society. He's actually talking about investing more in some of the least friendly environmental policies.
Yeah, I think the answer to that question is really difficult, primarily because we don't really know what comes out of the coalition formation, right? So what's important to understand is that the Netherlands has the most proportional electoral system in the world, and as a result has a very fragmented party system, right? So 15 parties are in parliament right now. It's impossible to win a majority government for a single party, so always coalitions need to be formed. And so it's up in the air whether Geert Wilders will even enter a coalition. If it does, we are unsure which parties he would have to compromise with, right? So yes, if it were all up to him, it would spell very bad news for climate change mitigation. There would be a binding referendum on leaving the European Union for the Netherlands, support for Ukraine on behalf of the Dutch defense apparatus would be reduced, et cetera, et cetera. But I don't think he will be able to do many of those things unilaterally, for sure, and even and then again, I'm not even sure if it's a realistic possibility that we'll see a stable majority government with coalition partners who see eye to eye anytime soon.
That's very interesting. Very quickly, Joram or Edward, if you feel we mentioned, Dilan Yeşilgöz. She is the VVD. It's the second biggest party now in parliament. She's talked about forming a coalition with Geert Wilders. She's not sure if she wants to see him as prime minister. But how interesting a character is she? Because this is someone who came to the country as an immigrant from a Muslim nation. And now she seems to be, I don't know if sympathetic is a fair term, to the anti-immigration policies of the right. I mean, how symbolic is that of the split personalities of some of these political leaders in the Netherlands? Quickly, go ahead, Edward.
Very quickly, I would just say, I think, of course, a very attractive person for the VVD's idea of running an anti-migration campaign, especially because they're insisting we want sensible, strict migration policies that are not racist, right? So we are not the VVD or Forum for Democracy or any of the other smaller far-right parties. We are a party that's sensible about migration, and we're not racist. We have a migrant in charge.
So unfortunately, that will have to be the final word. I'd like to thank all three of my panelists so much for being with us. Great to have you all. And our viewers, of course, for joining us as well. Remember, you can follow us on X, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.